So just very briefly, our talk tonight is a panel discussion titled Confederation Correspondents, and it's all about letters to Joey Smallwood. I'm not going to go on in depth about the abstract, as you're going to hear that from our wonderful host of presenters. I'm going to move on just into introducing them and then just turning the event over to our speakers this evening. So we have a very rich panel tonight. First of all, we have, of course, Sonia Boone, an award-winning researcher and writer and teacher and flautist, author of books including What the Ocean Remembers, and to note, a passionate writer of life stories and archives and feminist theory. And we're very fortunate to have Sonia joining us tonight online. We have, of course, Vicki Hallett as well, Associate Professor in the Department of Gender Studies here at Memorial, author of Mistress of the Blue Castle, and a very active historian and also a member of this board. We have Terry Bishop Sterling, a native St. John's, who has taught Newfoundland and Labrador history at Memorial for over 35 years, another also long-serving executive member of the Historical Society, and a very active public historian who will also be speaking tonight. We also have Andrea Callahan, author of The Debt, who is lives here in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. We also have on the panel Heidi Coombs, an independent historian with a PhD in history who specializes in 20th century outport nursing and medicine, particularly on the northern coast these days, and also, of course, a member of the board and a former past president. Very good mentor of mine, I might say, as well. We also have Sheila Hallett, who is currently negotiating the very changing world of Newfoundland and Labrador. She earned her master's degree from Memorial University, and most importantly, raised a wonderful family and feels blessed with a remarkably talented grandson. And last but not least of all, we of course have Johanne Harris, a first-generation townie from Kitsumikuk, Mi'kmaq, French, English, and Scottish roots from around the bay and the bush and an island apart. And they're a proud rabbit townie with a penchant for doggos and veg growing and all kinds of wonderful hobbies. And of course, connected with this book and researching this important topic. And so on that note, I just want to say that we will have time for questions. Our evening will probably go till about 9 o'clock tonight. And we just want to thank everybody again for coming. And on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Sonia, who will be speaking to you via online from the WebEx. So I'm going to walk away and we're going to get started. Thank you so much, everyone.
I'm going to actually say I switched it off. Vicki goes first, so I'm sending that off to Vicki. You're muted, Vic.
Can you hear me now, Sonia?
Who's going first?
I'm going to go first.
You're going to go first. Okay.
Back to me.
Much fun.
It was like a class when I had like 50, 20 somethings who were like, do this, press this button. You're so old. Well, too bad. Here I am.
That's me too, so it's all right.
Yeah, okay, it's all good. Okay, all right. Oh, thank you all so much for being here and being patient and finding this space. I'm so delighted. It's wonderful. Thank you to Rebecca for those introductions. Thanks to the Historical Society for inviting us. Thanks, of course, to our wonderful panelists who are delightful, and to all of you for coming. So this roundtable is about the lives and stories of everyday Newfoundlanders and Labradorians as they navigated what was arguably the biggest political transition of their lifetimes, the entry of Newfoundland into Confederation with Canada. Together with almost 30 other contributors, we've been involved in a collective project and collaborative project that brings together archival materials, personal reflections, poetic and visual responses, scholarly essays, all to consider how Newfoundlanders and Labradorians understood themselves and their world at the time of Confederation. We draw on one of the province's richest archival treasures, the letters written to Joseph R. Smallwood before and during his time as Premier, specifically those written between 1948 and 1951, all of which are housed in the Archives and Special Collections Division of the QE2 Library right here on campus. People wrote to Smallwood from all over Newfoundland and Labrador, from places with names imposed by settler colonization, and from places with names that would, in the context of resettlement, disappear from maps in the not too distant future. Some lived in communities whose original names were never formally recognized. As we know, while Newfoundland became a province in 1949, Labrador would not be formally added until 2001. As a result, the names Damguk, Nitassinan, Natsiavut, and Natuhut appear nowhere in these letters to Smallwood, even as those names were always there, spoken in communities, lived in tradition, waiting to come back to wider consciousness. Such absences are stark in the settler colonial archive and are a reality that shape our understandings and misunderstandings of the past. They speak volumes about who and what we remember and who and what we sometimes deliberately forget. Sonia.
Thank you, Vicky.
How do I get
Um,
Sonia up here now?
All right.
No, that's okay.
Hey, so you guys trading back and forth?
I just want to.
Only one more time after this. Are we good? Excellent, excellent. So I'd love to see everybody in the hall, but unfortunately, I have a really good picture of Vicky at the moment, so that's good. The letters give a slice of insight into regional peculiarities of this place. So what was important to folks in Grand Falls, in the forested interior of the island of Newfoundland, was different from what was important to folks in St. Barb or White Bay, who lived along the remote northern coast of the province and thus far from necessary infrastructure. What mattered in St. John's East and West, the only urban districts in the new province, was not necessarily relevant to those living in rural outport communities in Burin, for example. The letters also offer insight into questions of gender and class and employment. Men were more likely to write in search of work so they could support their families, while many women wrote as mothers or widows, with some requesting financial support for clothing that would allow their children to go to school. Middle-class correspondents in urban St. John's wrote about different kinds of things and different kinds of employment than their rural counterparts. Disability is also a very common factor. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians had fought in 2 world wars, and even at home, many men worked in physically demanding and often dangerous industries such as fishing, sealing, forestry, and factory work, all of which took a toll. One correspondent, for example, recounted his own experiences in the fishery in a 1949 letter, and he wrote, "I was washed overboard and was rescued by some of the crowd, but got badly frozen when left in the snowdrifts until my shipmates traveled several miles to get assistance. I was so badly frozen that I spent several months in hospital. I lost some of my fingers, and what are left are gnarled and out of shape. Also, my feet are in much the same condition." Poverty, meanwhile, contributed to malnutrition, while geographic isolation and economic precarity resulted in limited access to health care. As a result, tuberculosis rates were high, much higher than Canada, the UK, and the USA, and many died or experienced lifelong after effects. In addition to this, local cultures and religious belief were very important. The pulpit was a site of political rhetoric. Roman Catholic Archbishop Edward Patrick Roche, for example, came up forcefully on the anti-Confederate side, and the provincial Grand Lodge of the Loyal Orange Association, in response, encouraged Protestants to resist this influence. Some districts, like Placentia St. Mary's and Ferryland, were overwhelmingly Catholic. Others, like Twillingate and Bergia-la-Poelle, were almost wholly Protestant. While eventual referendum results have conventionally been linked to religious affiliation, and while the anti-Confederate cause was bolstered in sermons from Roman Catholic pulpits, that equation is not necessarily as neat and tidy as it might at first look, and individual letters suggest a much more complex matrix was at play. Finally, and I have to say this is what I find the most interesting, the letters offer written records of local dialects, and in this way exist as vital testaments to local ways of living, thinking, and being. Many correspondents had limited access to formal education, and this is reflected in spelling, capitalization, and punctuation, and yet these seemingly quote-unquote inconsistently written documents can give incredible insight into how people spoke. They're material markers of dialects that are slowly disappearing, and attest to the specificity of each writer and each region in this province. And some of the letters, going off piece here, some of the letters, they sound like someone is speaking to you. It really is an oral tradition put into text. And I'll pass the mic back over to Vicky for the next section.
Labradorians ever sent to the Premier was kept and filed away. However, this is not the case. In some instances, letters were forwarded to other departments or offices, and only Smallwood's reply remains. It's also likely that some letters were misplaced, destroyed, lost, or otherwise waylaid, either in the Premier's office or other offices, or even before they arrived at their destination, of course. There are other issues to consider as well. A wide range of people wrote letters to Smallwood. This breadth is refreshing, but it's also deceptive in that it can obscure the absences. Largely absent from the correspondence, for example, are the individual voices of the most privileged. Thus, while some merchants, for example, wrote to Smallwood in their formal capacities as business owners, very few wrote more personal letters. This suggests that they likely had other avenues through which to approach Smallwood before and after he became Premier, with issues of personal or private concern. The voices of those who could not write are also absent. Those who were perhaps illiterate, ill, hospitalized, and or otherwise institutionalized invariably appeared only in letters written by others on their behalf, although there are a few notable exceptions. Others, meanwhile, may have chosen to fly under the radar rather than to advertise their social precarity. Finally, we must also consider that not all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians communicated in English, let alone in its written form. Among this group, we might include some Indigenous and newer immigrant communities. Very few letters that we saw address Indigenous concerns, for example. In addition to this, some 400 Chinese men immigrated to Newfoundland in the decades preceding Confederation. Of them, 40 sought Canadian citizenship in 1949, and yet we had been unable to find any letters to Smallwood from Chinese Newfoundlanders in the districts of St. John's East, West, or Harbour Bay and Bell Island between 1948 and 1951. Thus, while we can and should celebrate the incredible diversity and richness of this collection of letters and the stories they reveal, we should also be mindful of the stories that remain unwritten and unspoken, and therefore unheard. A great deal of thanks go out to everyone who has participated in this collaborative effort, and I really want to thank Colleen Quigley, Linda White, Paulette Noseworthy at the Archives and Special Collections for welcoming us and our contributors into the archive and going above and beyond to accommodate us even during the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, thanks to our next presenter, Terry Bishop Sterling, for introducing Sonia to this archive all those years ago.
Welcome, everybody. The District of Grand Falls was the one that I chose. It was a large and varied district. Elsewhere in the province, people fished and farmed, ran small and large businesses, and did clerical and retail work. Others worked in the mill in Grand Falls, the mine at Buckens, or the airport at Gander, which was a town undergoing a very interesting transition. But thousands of men made their living on the Gander, using buck saws to cut pulpwood for the Anglo-Newfoundland Development Company. Loggers included men who lived full-time in the district, but also many who had home communities in Trinity and Conception Bay and combined logging and fishing, a long time tradition. So I chose to focus on letters from loggers. There were many interesting letters from all kinds of people in the district, but I thought that was somewhat unique to that district, the importance of that industry. And also, as we know, 10 years after Confederation, encounters with these loggers would mark a very significant moment in our history, and certainly in Smallwood's reign. Many loggers expressed their desire for steady work, while others looked for less demanding and less demanding jobs, as the hard manual labor and rough living conditions took their toll. So those are two areas that I looked at: people who wanted improvements in the work and people who wanted out of that work. And then the third group of letters I looked at were some interesting ones from World War II veterans, wondering why they were not eligible for the veterans package, which came with the Confederation. So first to work. In a rare joint letter, two woods workers wrote to Smallwood when their current camp closed, stating, "We have no way to feed our families this winter." They assured Smallwood that they had voted for him 3 times, and then quoted him as promising that there would be 2 jobs for every man in Newfoundland after you get in power. They concluded by stating, "Depending on getting a job out of this letter." And I would say that for all of the contributors to this project, that was a pretty resounding theme. I voted for you, where's my job? Loggers who wrote to Smallwood did not complain about wages in the letters that I saw, and not even that much about the work, but the work was irregular. And men were employed for a few weeks on a particular site and then left to find their next camp. Letter writers hoped for steadier work after Confederation and expected Smallwood to reward their support with jobs. One man from Botwood gave a detailed account of moving from camp to camp seeking work in 1949, but managing no more than 3 months of employment. He had worked since losing his parents at the age of 12 and proudly concluded his letter, "I am not afraid of work and I never eat a bit of dole yet. But when you can't get a job, I can't take one." This, I've never taken a bit of dole is another common refrain I saw in many letters. Then there were the men who simply wanted out of this job. Men typically had to walk 6 miles a day to their camps. They labored all day with buck saws and then endured drafty, dirty, and uncomfortable bunk houses. Joint problems, accidents, and illness made it hard for many men to keep up the pace required by camp bosses anxious to meet their quotas. As a result of their working conditions, loggers were often old before their time and wrote to Smallwood asking about pensions or, more often, alternate work. A World War I veteran who had his arm broken up during the war was no longer able for woods work by 1949. He told Smallwood, "It is hard for me to do any hard work. In fact, I can't do it. I have been turned down by doctors not to use the buck saw. They have told me if I keep using her, I would lose my arm someday." Another man who wrote at least twice described how he had raised a family of 5 working in the woods with an axe or a buck saw, despite the fact that he had lost a hand in the mill 15 years before. He still had 1 daughter at home in school. The company now considered him disabled and would not employ him any further. He wrote asking what the government could do for him. And then, as I said, there were some interesting letters from World War II veterans. Many loggers from Grand Falls District had joined the Newfoundland Overseas Forestry Unit, which spent World War II logging in Scotland. Their work, cutting timber for essential industries, including pit props for Britain's mines, was advertised as essential war work, and recruiters pushed hard to enlist experienced Newfoundland loggers. One veteran from Badger described how he had struggled with illness since his war and consequently found it hard to keep regular employment. He wrote Smallwood asking whether he qualified for veterans benefits. "I served about 3.5 years in the Newfoundland Forestry Overseas and was discharged before the end of hostilities owing to suffering with rheumatic fever. I was laid up 6 months after arriving home, after which I was employed with the Department of Public Works for about 3 months. Since that time, I have worked with the A&D company about 4 months out of the 12, and the rest of the time I have not done much of anything, and I am still suffering from the rheumatic fever, at times more than others." Similarly, another man questioned why Newfoundland foresters did not qualify for the veterans' benefits, as they had been led to believe they would. "I am a man who served with the Newfoundland Forestry Unit in Scotland for 5.5 years. After being over there 2 years, I tried to enlist into one of the armed forces, but wouldn't be admitted, being told that the work being done by the foresters was too essential. I then joined the Home Guard, and I gave all my spare time into training to defend Britain if need be. Unlike the soldiers, we weren't paid for our training." After consulting with Veterans Affairs, Smallwood replied that while he agreed that these men had played an important role, they were considered civilian workers, paid accordingly, and able to return home or transfer to a fighting unit at the end of the initial contract. This response does not correspond to the experience of forestry vets. And these letters foreshadow a more organized fight for recognition, which began in the 1960s and didn't conclude till 2000. So by the time they got benefits, it was not of much help to these letter writers. In conclusion, logging employed large numbers of Newfoundland men from the late 19th century onward. The story of these laborers, as well as loggers' contribution to the war efforts, deserves attention. What struck me most about loggers' letters was the extreme conditions under which they lived and worked. Men endured the stress of uncertain employment, as well as frequent injuries and long-time physical strains, resulting in constant pain and the inability to continue in logging or the other labor-intensive work available to them. Loggers hoped that Confederation would provide more job security and more options for those who could no longer endure woods work. But political change provided no quick fix. Loggers' working conditions did not improve in the decade following Confederation, ultimately leading to the 1959 International Woodworkers of America strike, one of the most violent and bitter labor actions in the province's history. So while the problems in the woods industry were not created by Confederation, it did not really change or help that experience for these men.
Good. How's this? Hello. Look, I'm huge. Hello. I'm Andrea Callanan. I'm not a historian at all. I'm a poet, and I've never done any archival work. So this, being invited to be part of this project was really thrilling for me. It really stretched what I know how to do. And I was working from letters from the Fortune Bay Hermitage district, which, as this crowd will know, was devastated by a tsunami in 1929. My grandmother was born in that tsunami. My grandmother was born November 17th, 1929, in a community that is no longer there, but that was called Cul-de-sac. It was like a smidge west of this district. So that's why I wanted to work with these letters, and I was really drawn to them. And I picked mostly, the letters that sort of jumped out to me were mostly, probably because I was thinking about my grandmother, were mostly letters from women who were writing about their lives as mothers, their lives, many of them as widows. And as a poet, I'm really used to working from prompts and responding to suggestions and ideas. And I struggled mightily with this. I had a very hard time thinking of something to say back to these women that they weren't already saying better than I ever could. Their letters, despite the challenges of, in many cases, very, what we would consider low literacy, which I expect in their communities was probably not as low comparatively. Despite many of these difficulties, they conveyed so much that just struck me over and over again about the levels of poverty, the levels of frustration, the levels of anger in many cases, of writing to this man who had made great promises and was yet to deliver on them. So what I decided to do was to pull some lines that really resonated with me and sort of weave a poem into them. So a lot of you are probably familiar with poems that are acrostics, where you have like a word or a line that goes down the sort of beginning of the lines and you read across, and then if you read down, you get a different sort of story there. And so the way I did it was sort of the opposite. It's based on a kind of poetry writing, which I won't bore everyone with, but it's called the golden shovel, where you arrange your words down the ends of the lines. So instead of starting with them, you're writing into them. So I chose 3 lines from 3 different letters. And the first one in my first stanza is the line from a letter from a woman from Bay Despair. And the line is, "Will you please give this your careful consideration and let me know if I am justified in making this request?" And then the next one is from English Harbor East, a woman there, a widow. And the line is, "Try for God's sake to send me along my widow check, as I need it so bad. I am yours truly." And then signs her name. And the third one is, "I know you are the man to write to about things, Do your best to oblige me. And so these are the 3 lines that I wrote into. And what I ended up writing was really about the process of engaging with history and understanding my place in it. So my eldest daughter and my grandmother both figure in this poem. It's called Yours Truly, Yours Very Truly. So when I tell her, I don't know what this place will look like in the end, what I mean is you and I and everyone could vanish in an instant. Please don't misunderstand. I don't wish to give the impression that I'm always this catastrophic of mind. It's just that it's happened before. Your great-grandmother was born in a tsunami, I tell her, careful in my recollection of details. For your consideration, my daughter and I walk under blue and cloudless skies along an overpass. Let the record show, she obliges me by listening, or she appears to listen. You know, no, wait, hang on. I can't remember if I already told you this part. The wedding band I wear is 150 years old. I am not sure my grandmother was justified in handing off something so precious, in handing to me our family's history, in making me the clumsy keeper of this keepsake from a home long washed away. I request a recount. I am not cut out for this. When I try to see myself in this story, my focus scatters. For once in my life, can I just pay attention? God is in the detail. God is the detail. For argument's sake, let's say there's this wedding band, which was given to me. It's all that survived, more or less. I send my aunt photos of the ring when she asks me to. She wants to save the family's history to hand along. I am embarrassed by my fat fingers and my deep-etched palms. My grandmother dodged widowhood by divorcing twice. Checkmate. I had wanted my daughter to know her as well as I had. I got distracted. The details are God's. I am embarrassed by the inelegance of my hand. I need to remind myself that my hand writes me into the story, that it too is my family's history, for what it's worth. So when I tell my daughter, this place is bad, but it could always be worse, what I mean is, none of us knows what another is thinking. Am I cut out for this? If a gold ring had once been yours, would you want the likes of me to have it? Truly? My daughter listens, appears to listen, as I try to make her see herself in this story. She ought to know where we've come from. I ought to know. You and I, well, that which we are. That's Tennyson. Closer to home, I am the king of my own little island. What man wouldn't lust for the power to make such a claim? I write a book of poems and dedicate it to my grandmother. I write about my place in our story and about the things that have distracted me from all I'd meant to do. So when I tell my daughter, you are your mother's daughter, what I mean is, you are the best thing that could have happened to me. I mean to say, you are the reason I came back here. I mean, oblige me while I tell you one more story. Oblige me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First things first, no, I did not vote in the Confederation election. Okay. Joey Smallwood, quote, Judas Iscariot, betrayer of his people, or, quote, a great man of vision and endurance. My mother referred to Joey as the little fellow from Gambo, and this was not meant as a compliment. My mother-in-law was as avid, can't hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. I'll pretend I'm screaming at the kids. Okay, so starting it? No? This will be worse. Better? Oh. Okay. So Joey Smallwood, quote. Thank you. Judas Iscariot, betrayer of his people, or quote, a great man of vision and endurance. My mother referred to Joey as the little fellow from Gambo, and this was not meant as a compliment. My mother-in-law was as avid a Joey supporter as my mother was anti-Joey. Fun. My parents were East Enders from St. John's. They spent several years in Gander, and it was there they met Joey. My in-laws, by contrast, were fishermen and women from Flat Island in Bonavista Bay. Joey was a frequent visitor at my parents' home in Gander, where he expounded his views on the benefits of Confederation, benefits which my mother already enjoyed as a middle-class resident of St. John's. However, there were no doctors in Flat Island, no hospitals, no grocery stores, and education, while provided, was not readily available and was conducted in a one-room school. My mother and mother-in-law's opinions were so different that I often wished I could go back in time to hear voices from that period. Researching the letters written to Joey between the period we chose, 1948 to 51, gave me that opportunity. I initially chose St. John's East District. I was very excited to find a letter written on April 1st, 1949. Some say the actual date of Confederation, which echoed my mother's opinion of Joey and was possibly more virulent. According to this letter writer, Joey, quote, acted the Judas Iscariot and sold Newfoundland for a mess of pottage. He went on to call upon the spirit of his beloved dead father to, quote, haunt you in the years to come for having done this deed against the wishes of the people. I was equally as excited to find another letter written May 24th, 1949. This correspondent from Hooch Cove praised Joey for his vision, comparing him to, quote, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. That such diverse opinions could be held by so many about one person and one issue spoke volumes. As far as I was concerned, I was still only just looking at one district. The letters to Joey are fascinating. There are letters congratulating him, letters asking him for jobs, pensions, help in finding adequate housing, paying medical bills, all issues that are as relevant today as they were in 1949. Many things impressed me about those letters. The belief held by all the letter writers that they could write directly to Joey, the premier, the belief that he would read the letters himself and would respond to them personally, although there were few replies recorded in files that I accessed. And finally, the belief that Joey could, and more importantly, would fix each situation to everyone's satisfaction. Almost made me feel sorry for Joey. Some of the letters written to Joey were so personal, they were heartbreaking. In one letter, a woman with 6 children and another on the way asked Joey if he could find a job for her husband, a, quote, sober and reliable man whose only drawback was his lack of education and the fact that he had only, quote, what he stands in for clothing, a situation which prevented him from even going to church. But there were also letters that expressed a commitment to the future of Newfoundland. One letter signed simply a mother called on Joey, the, quote, the poor person's champion for their rights, to help her daughter and the other young women working in the clothing industry in St. John's receive fair treatment from their newly formed union. Another from one of Joey's supporters, who, while supportive of Joey's new relief program, thought the rate of pay under the program was too low. Familiar? The same writer took Joey to task for the rising cost of living, especially the cost of tobacco, reminding Joey that one of his objectives as leader was, quote, a better means of living for the working man. Joey's response to that letter was very interesting. While he agreed, quote, that times are not very good, and while he was, quote, very much dissatisfied with the cost of living and was trying to do something about it, quote, Rome was not built in a day. From reading the letters, it seems obvious that the people of St. John's East had been listening to Joey's radio speeches and were paying attention to the promises he made during his campaign. And while they were willing to give him a chance, they were not going to sit quietly by. Such, for example, was the letter from a fisherman in St. Thomas's who challenged Joey to prove his claim that he was, quote, a friend of the fisherman, the farmer, and in fact, the country. By fixing the roads in that area, so fishermen from there in Paradise could access their traditional fishing grounds. I was annoyed, but at the same time admitted and admired the audacity of the letter writer who asked for a favor in obtaining a swill contract with the new airport at Torbay. Just to ensure Joey's support, he was, quote, tucking away $100 as a little incentive. And just as I was annoyed, I was also amazed by the letters from individual citizens and existing successful businesses. There was a sense of hope and excitement in these letters. All correspondents emphasized that small to medium-sized businesses that utilize the skills and abilities of Newfoundlanders would, based on experience, be most successful. Overall, the letters I read made me sad, infuriated, and very proud to be a Newfoundlander, because in spite of the hardships endured, people continued to believe in and have faith in each other and the future of Newfoundland. Both my mother and mother-in-law would lay claim to being right about Joey. And in many cases and ways, they both were. Meanwhile, as the controversy still rages on, those of us who call this place home live in hope and work hard for a better tomorrow. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Joanne.
Okay, great. Hi. So the title of my response in the forthcoming book definitely reflects its contents, but also probably the next 5 to 7 minutes of me talking. And the title was, If Only I Could Casually Brain Dump on Joey Smallwood via Messenger at 2 a.m. So that was really born from the fact that there's just so much to say about the experience of reading the letters and choosing them. It was really challenging writing a response. I found it really hard to focus on like something precise and to narrow it down because there were just so many different threads of interest. And ultimately, I'm not a historian, but the medium is what really spoke to me and how and what people choose to communicate about. So really, I did find the content was just so dense. It often felt like looking in a distorted mirror, reflecting back current issues. You can really see a lot of those themes emerge. But it was hard to narrow down. Do I want to focus on women in work, education, disability? I did find that very overwhelming in responding to the letters. And not only the issues that people faced, but how they reflect the essence of being human, you know, our humanity. And one thing that really emerged from the 2 districts I looked at was connection and communication. There was so much emphasis on like getting a phone line, keeping our postal service, establishing a formal postal service. They often did that from their own, you know, their own resources. They weren't getting paid. They maintained those systems. So that, I think, definitely inspired what I ended up doing in writing a letter to Joey as though he's alive now in the modern era. And another thing too that emerged when I was looking for all what I did submit, I found a whole bunch of my drafts, and I noticed a theme there in my own work is that I kept opening them with, Joey, we always get told by therapists to write a letter to your younger self or someone that hurt you to process trauma. Because man, like a lot of what I read was really like had me just like I cried. I had to leave the room to take a break and breathe because it was tough stuff. But at the same time, that's not what I wanted to focus on was, you know, trauma. So I tried to bring in a well-rounded selection of letters. But that concept of trauma, I think, really speaks to our sort of shared development or shared history. And for me, it also created a sort of generational empathy. It deepened that and created a better understanding of what I come from as a first generation townie. So it was really interesting exploring it in that sort of emotional way. But yeah, I really couldn't stop thinking about how people communicated with Joey. I was very inspired by the familiarity and the often stream of conscious letters, versus how would constituents now hypothetically communicate with Joey using modern technology. I kept coming back to the peak of the pandemic when we had those live streams from the government on Facebook talking about, oh, we're doing this with the pandemic, and the way people would get up to absolute shenanigans and sass in the comments to our government leaders in a very familiar way. Like just seeing that through line in terms of how we communicate as a people and our spirit. So as much as there was often a great deal of respect and reverence for Joey and Confederation in the letters from the constituents I looked at, there was an awful lot of just fantastic, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. This are my thoughts. Buddy, what are you doing? Like there was spirit, there was some spunk and sass in there, and I loved that. So I did look at 2 districts. I had initially hoped to do St. George's Humber, which would have covered where my family is from in terms of my mother and my Mi'kmaq ancestry and family connections. And it's also an area where I have a great deal of knowledge of the Mi'kmaq family names. So while we may have not seen clear Indigenous issues emerge, I think it would have been really interesting to pair those family names that have like really strong ties to a possibility of emerging issues. So maybe someday it's something that I can personally revisit because I know it brought a lot of interesting ideas up for me. But again, that whole pandemic and putting restrictions on how often you could access the archives definitely created a bit of a barrier there. So my next choice was actually Burgeo-Lapoile because I had spent time in Burgeo and I had a sense of its geography and its isolation and the people there now. I love that community, just a fantastic place. I was there for work doing community interviews, a really special place. And then, of course, with the pandemic, people dropped out of the project, so I also picked up letters from Bonavista South. And I'm really glad I had that opportunity because it gave me a chance to observe how geography and isolation and industry created differences, but then how we still have these core similarities of our needs as human beings, what we need and what we want and what we aspire for our children, you know? Like you can still see those through lines in people's experiences and their relationships. So a few things definitely did dictate my letter selection. And as I've said, I found it really hard narrowing it down. I did try to cover a broad perspective rather than focusing on a set through line. I tried to pull in some of the positive, some of the negative, the conspiratorial. I loved the ones who were like, hey, watch out for this, or hey, this is happening. And I think it's because this guy in industry thinks, yeah, and then there was also the enamored. Like one guy wrote a prayer. Like he wrote a prayer to Confederation, which I thought was like beautiful, especially when you think of how we often have like a really negative attitude towards Confederation, but for some people it really was supposed to be this great life-changing, and it was a great life-changing thing because it brought in consistent government support in places where industry just didn't provide enough economic prosperity to, you know, have shoes for your children. Um, and it was also really hard to choose what letters to include and what to cut. Again, there were some that made me cry, and I left the archives for a few minutes. One of them was a series of telegrams in which I assumed the gentleman that they are trying to get a doctor to see died in the end, because as they talk about his worsening condition and how far the doctor is, it's just like, wow, this is really bleak. But it was almost reminiscent of how people live tweet incidents, right? Like seeing that form of communication, the telegraph versus how we tweet, right? So that was another really fascinating thing for me. Yeah, people, they went through some really horrible stuff, but there were things that made me laugh. Again, those conspiratorial things, or the requests of like, hey, how about you send me a bottle of brandy? Or like another one that's just, oh, we think we have a Confederate victory. Please send something for so many seal flippers to celebrate, which is like, I love that. I like that that's what you're planning to celebrate with now. A modern liberal victory would involve way bougier food, you know? Um, yeah, and then a lot of them touched me because they were just the humanity in them. The desires were basic, they were essential, and they were things we often take for granted. I do know that I definitely did place some emphasis of my selection on, sorry, to use the language at the time, people who are crippled, because I do live with physical disability. I spent a few years on social assistance due to an injury, so I found that really relatable and distressing at times, because like that, like I'm getting upset now because it was extremely traumatic period of my life, was to experience that extreme insecurity of like, how am I going to feed myself? Can I actually keep living where I'm living? Can I keep paying my rent? Am I ever going to get out of this? Will I re-enter the workforce? Like, there was some very deep, heavy things in there, especially with Burgeo Lapoil being such an isolated place. And you know what? I can also, like, what's amazing about these letters is how vivid they are. Even the ones that I couldn't include, either because I just didn't have enough time and patience to, like, properly transcribe them letter for letter, where you're like, oh, buddy, that handwriting is a little too much, even though your story is fascinating. And other times it did, sometimes it felt repetitive and sad. So I really wanted to provide a balanced representation. But yeah, one that stood out for me that I realized I didn't include, and I can't believe it, was there was a letter from a young man looking for financial resources. This was in the Bonavista South District. He wanted to finish school. He wanted to graduate and go on to become a teacher, but they didn't have the financial resources. There was, like, I think you were cut off from your some sort of subsidy for children at the time. And I actually Googled him because it was such a great letter. And I was like, you know what? This guy is either alive or probably recently passed, and I'm a nosy poke. And I found his obituary, and he did it. He made it to school, he got his education, and he became a teacher. And that really also then made me think of like those through lines moving forward in communicating this stuff. Like, wouldn't it be amazing to take this information, these stories of our past, and that have shaped us as people, and find families and learn about them, like learn how these stories carried on, because that was just amazing. And that was also another example, like often I saw examples of people who were like, I'm 16, I'm in my last year of school, but we don't have the money. How am I going to do this? My dad needs me to drop out to take care of the kids. So that was really amazing. Another point is that I really found the letters challenge so much perspective, like that whole, our nostalgia for the good old days. Oh boy, no, those were not good old days in some of those places. I'm sorry. Right before Confederation, some of that stuff was tough. But then at the same time, I'm someone who grew up in the 90s. Like, I'm a child in the well, born in the 80s, but child of the 90s. So I grew up in the post-moratorium mentality and narrative. So I heard an awful lot of the out-migration or the handout concept of like, no, we're just looking for, that's our way of life, has always been looking for that handout. But oftentimes, no, people wanted that work. Like, either they were incapable of working, so they needed support, or they wanted meaningful employment. They wanted to work in the industry that was familiar and relevant to them. Yeah, so that was another thing that really stood out to me. And then to just touch on a few, yeah, another point relevant to that mentality is people were often looking for something to help them build their own industry. Like, one man wanted money to start up a mill to spin yarn, to process sheep's wool and create yarn. Another man asked for however much length of twine to make rope so he could keep his hands busy and the devil from his mind in the dark of winter. And like, that's relatable content. We all need a hobby, and you gotta respect someone going, you know what? I can both make some rope and keep the devil out of my mind. Another thing that didn't make the cut that really stood out to me too was a teacher asking for a map for their school. Can you imagine not knowing where you are, having no concept of that? We don't have that experience. There's a map right behind Sonia in her in her image. I spend time on Google Maps going for a walk to look at places I'd really love to go to. And yet this is a school with everyone, every new generation of this community have no visual concept of where they are besides what they know and where they've been, which is just fascinating. And I really hope that not only do people like take the time to read this book, but I hope this really sparks an interest in these letters, because I would love to see, like, we have such a fascinating and fabulous film industry, and it would be so beautiful to see either some of these brought to life on stage or in the medium of film, right? Extending that medium of communication to encompass something even more, to make these stories more accessible and relatable, and to learn, just get such a great concept of what we come from and what has shaped us and our communities and our dynamics. So yeah, that's really the extent of my brain dumping about Joey Smallwood, because I brain dumped on him. Thank you very much.
So I'm actually going to build on a lot. It's good to say that's fantastic, but perhaps a more somber tone. The letters that Newfoundlanders in the district of White Bay wrote to Smallwood in the early years of Confederation offer an intimate and revealing look into their lives, their hopes and dreams for the future, and their feelings of connection with a man they did not know. People openly shared their life stories with Smallwood, exhibiting tremendous vulnerability, often disclosing tragic personal circumstances and very difficult living situations in their requests for old age pensions, widow allowances, and disability assistance. They sent urgent telegrams during medical emergencies and asked for an air ambulance or a doctor to be sent to their community right now by plane immediately. And in the beginning, Smallwood, he did that. They asked for seed potatoes and fishing equipment and for help finding their lost cod traps. Imagine writing the premier and asking, can you help me find my lost cod traps? They requested radios, telephones, weekly mail services for their communities. Many outpour communities didn't have these basic amenities at the time. Some of the more industrious asked for jukeboxes, licenses to sell homebrew, and permission to start hotel businesses. But there was one letter in the collection that stood out from all the others for me. It captured so much of the essence of Outport, Newfoundland at the time, of people's living conditions and the challenges they faced and their incredible strength of character. So I am going to tell you a story, a true story, a story that still puts a lump in my throat from the very first time I read this letter, and I might get choked up, so please forgive me. I would like to transport you back to Outport, Newfoundland in the bleak midwinter of 1951. On the east side of the Northern Peninsula, in a community called Canada Harbor, which has since been resettled, a 5-month-old baby boy lay dying. There was no doctor or nurse in the community. The closest nursing station was 15 miles away, operated by the Grenfell Mission at Roddickton. There were no telephones or telegraphs at Canada Harbor. The only way to contact the nurse for help was to physically go to the station. And that is what the baby's parents tried to do. On Monday, January 15th, they realized that the baby was very sick and needed help. But it was winter on the Northern Peninsula and the ice was in, making the bay between Canada Harbor and Angley impassable. And without getting to Angley, there was no way to get to Roddickton. 3 days later, the ice moved off and the baby's father, along with several others from the community, were able to reach Roddickton. However, the nurse, Joan Cattell, had a maternity case at the time and she couldn't leave the station. Joan Cattell was an exceptionally capable British nurse employed by the Grenfell Mission, but she was the only nurse on the east side of the Northern Peninsula from St. Anthony to Harbor Deep, and she alone covered over 100 miles of rugged coastline. There were few roads on this side of the peninsula, and most of the communities were only accessible by sea. Since she could not leave the station, she provided tablets, I assume it was aspirin, for the baby, and the father returned home. But over the next few days, the baby's condition continued to decline. The parents had no choice but to go back to Roddickton, this time with their little boy. But the ice was in again, and they again could not reach Angley. Finally, on Friday, January 26th, the wind changed, the bay opened up, and the baby's mother, Sarah, set off with her son. Her husband got them safely to Angley, and from there she secured a dog team to Roddickton. By the time she arrived at the nursing station, the baby was in critical condition. Nurse Cattell tried all weekend to get the Grenfell Mission's air ambulance to bring the baby to St. Anthony, to no avail. On Monday, she decided they could not wait any longer. She would bring him to St. Anthony herself by dog team to Mainbrook and then snowmobile to St. Anthony, leaving first thing Tuesday morning. But when they woke Tuesday morning, the baby was dead. Sarah found herself grieving her son at Roddickton alone, without the comfort of her family and facing the arduous journey back to Canada Harbor. In the days that followed, as she wrote to Smallwood, quote, "The kindness and hospitality of Nurse Cattell and the people of Roddickton could not be excelled. They did all that could be done to make me feel comfortable and help me bear my never forgotten trouble of losing my baby." On the journey back, she was delayed again at Angley for 3 days because of the ice. And in her letter to Smallwood, she praised the kindness and sympathy of the people of Angley during that difficult time. Sarah's letter to Smallwood was at once personal, political, and poignant. It captured the anxiety and grief of parents who did everything they could to save their son in very difficult circumstances. It captured the challenges of getting medical care in rural and remote areas of the province where help was so far away and travel often complicated by difficult terrain and unpredictable weather. And it captured the community and compassion of other people who came together to help the family reach Roddickton and to support Sarah as she traveled back home with her dead baby. By writing to Smallwood, Sarah had channeled her grief into advocating for basic amenities and better medical services for her community. Smallwood responded with sympathy and respect. He blamed previous governments for neglecting White Bay and outlined his plan to work with the Grenfell Mission to expand medical services in the district, including the establishment of more nursing stations. And indeed, government-funded Grenfell services in White Bay expanded significantly after this period. A new nursing station was built at Angley later that same year, and new stations at Roddickton in 1957, Conch in 1961, and Harbor Deep in 1962, all built with funding from the Canadian government. Smallwood was true to his word about increasing medical services in White Bay, but this all came too late for a 5-month-old little boy from Canada Harbor. One can only hope that this tragic circumstance and Sarah's advocacy hastened government action in expanding medical services in White Bay and saved other lives in the district, because there were many children like the little boy from Canada Harbor, and there were many Sarahs in Outport, Newfoundland and Labrador. Before Confederation, Newfoundland had by far the highest infant mortality rate in the Western world. In 1940, it was 91 per 1,000 live births, compared to 64 in Canada, 40 in the United States, 36 in Australia, and 31 in New Zealand. By 1950, the rate had declined to 57.6, but was still the highest of all the Canadian provinces. And behind these statistics, behind each of those 57.6 per 1,000, there was a little child, like the little boy from Canada Harbor, and a grieving family. So I would like to close by noting that when we have talked about Confederation over the past 75 years, we haven't talked about this part of the history and these stories. We haven't talked about the impact of Confederation on everyday people, on Outport people, on working people, on mothers and fathers and families and communities, on the elderly and those with disabilities. But when you dig into the archives and learn the history, it becomes clear that Confederation was a major contributing factor in the increased standard of living among Newfoundlanders and Labradorians in the second half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so that's a whole lot of information. And there are so many things we didn't get to talk about, of course. Every district in the province was looked at. We had folks look at letters from every different part of the province. They chose to respond, as you already have seen here from this selection of people, in very different ways. And they chose letters based on their interest and what resonated with them. And if you chose another 30 people to look at the letters, they'd choose a whole different passel of letters and get a whole different set of responses. So, you know, this book or this collection is not meant to be the definitive response to Confederation. It's a response. It's a collaborative response. And we do think that what's fascinating about it is the very personal, relatable stories that you find in these letters. They're just fascinating. That's the only word. They're heartbreaking, they're funny, they're irreverent, they're scathing, they're brilliant. They're brilliant, and they're just so great. So yeah, and they're here. They're on this campus. Anyone can look at them. You're free to go there anytime. So please do so. And yes, make a film, write a play. Yes, I love that idea, Joan. Okay, questions. I am up here, but I'm taking questions from whoever would like to ask one, and any of us can answer those questions. Let's see if there are questions in the chat. There are a lot. Okay.
There's nothing.
Oh, there's not. Oh, okay.
It's just about what's happening.
Okay, Grant.
If there are questions in the space, can you please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Why are they? Shouldn't they have gone to the British Archive?
Yes, good question. Joey Smallwood donated them specifically to Memorial University. I don't know. Did he have the right to do anything? The man did what he wanted. He messed up our whole event here tonight. I blame him personally. He was here haunting us. I don't know if he had that right, but he did it. He put his papers here. He wanted them to be at this university, and so here they are.
Yeah. It was probably well before the archive.
Thanks, Terry. So, yeah, so did Joey have the right to donate his papers to the archive here? We don't know, but he did it anyway. Classic move. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
You believe that our standard of living?
Do I personally believe it? Did our standard of living actually improve after we joined Canada. I can only tell you that based on the letters that we looked at, and the many, many, many people who were struggling to survive on virtually nothing, that yes, I do believe it did. Would it have also improved if we had not joined Canada? I don't know. Do I believe that everyone in this province benefited equally from Confederation? No, I do not. That's a complicated question, right? Depends on who you ask and how your life turned out and how their family's life turned out. Whether they were written into the terms of Confederation or as Indigenous people were written out of the terms of Confederation. So it varied and varies a great deal. And I'm not the only person who could answer that question. What do our other panelists think about whether or not our lives improved after Confederation? Does anyone else want to take that up? Oh, what would the grandparents say? Here, you want this? Oh, yes. Yes, you do.
My mother would say, no, maybe not. My mother would say, straight.
Depends.
So I really think where you were in the province. If, for instance, my parents, my mother's from St. John's. Yeah.
Ish.
Ish. My mother and I problem with democracy. They also were in class and probably more English because they were, operating in home and it'd be fisheries. They had quite a good ones. They were added focus and it was not really personal as the focus job. So my mother enjoyed being said Joey Robbins. But that can be the one. And like that, other people who weren't very involved all the times. So I had no place to educate my kids and so they can sit. Maybe not. Economic and social.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complex. It's a complex question. Yeah, yeah. No, anybody else want to take a stab at it? It's complex. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Were there any letters in the collection? Any?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so mostly those came from St. John's, I would say. And so were there, yes, sorry, Rebecca, yes, no, it's okay. Were there any letters that people found that dealt with conspiracies or who felt that the whole process was unfair or dishonest? And so we would say, yes, there were. But you want to speak to that? Oh, yeah. I think Joanne had a.
This person. And that one of our set was issued that they were told in their district, this is that if you leave the bonus, then kids when they turn 16 boys, when they turn 16 years old, their parents are in the bonus. Those kids would be sent to mainland and be conscripted into the armed forces. We have halves. So we're better off not with the mission. So we don't want your kids for mission script. So we quickly divide it. Sure. But that's the kind of thing that is also depending on the district, if it was predominantly, I didn't make a lot of religious things in there, but something more like the responsible government crowd were spreading lies about the Confederation. And we showed that to come out and tell people that was not true. Of course, we believe it's true. We didn't have much of it. So there was some conspiracy theorists, but not people truly believe that Here's what it is. Here's what the child is. We were smarter than. Truthfully or not, most of the others that I read,
Here
they
too.
were strong support.
Do you want that? Sorry.
Yeah, so, we said, well, I voted, of course.
Good
Now,
to
but whether that's true or not, whether they were supporters, things do get, maybe a bias toward people who vote, who felt, well, done the right things.
I think it'll, oh, good, it reaches. All right, wonderful. I also just want to make a point to say some of the comments from the chat there, as we are also going very close to our time with 9 o'clock. So we do have to be a bit cognizant of time this evening. We did, of course, have that late start where we were displaced and had to reconvene in a different room. So thank you, everyone, for all of your time. So just want to note that Lisa Daly says, fantastic conversation tonight. Look forward to the book. Christopher asks a question. We'll have an answer to in a second. Is there any plan to digitize the Smallwood letters in particular? And also, if you want to speak a bit more about the book, everyone I think in the chat is very excited about that. Valentine Linehan says, I'm new to the NLHS, and I think the presentation was great. Thank you so much. Leona English, of course, a known scholar, says the effects of Confederation are undebatable. They are measured in increased life expectancy, increased employment, lower infant mortality, access to education and higher education. Thank you for that comment and contributing to discussion in the chat there, Leona English. And also, oh no, that's just a chat information about our membership was posted by Lisa, who's also a board member there in the chat. So I do want to say, as we're very close to time, just to put it to the chat, if you would like to put a question, we'll have one of our speakers answer about the letters and a bit more about the book, and then we'll also take another question or so from the room, and then we're going to have to wrap up this wonderful, adapted evening. So the letters and anything.
So the letters are the digitized. We certainly hope so. And the archives and social collections to get more volume. And it's and so so we hope that it's not there's fully trying to digitize Muslims. The book that was coming out of this collection is it's in progress, and we certainly hope it's going to be out very soon. With those feature summary essays, short essays from various scholars talking about the context of the times, and then it also features responses to letters from every district in the province. So 2 weeks ago, those responses, like we said, are everything from poems to very personal reflections to art. So it's a really sort of effective.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Did you have any commentary as sort of co-editor of the book there, Sonia? 1 second, Stephen's gonna just unmute you.
I would just say, I just want to say the letters are the most amazing resource into the history, the 20th century, mid-20th century history of Newfoundland and Labrador. They are remarkable documents. And they, like, people talking about them, like, they just make me tear up. I'm not even from Newfoundland and Labrador. And the letters are so remarkable. They really show the passion of people for this place and for the future of this place, for what they hope this place can be and what it should be. And so from that perspective, they're just remarkable documents. And that's all I want to say about other parts. I think everybody else has covered. And I really want to thank everybody who participated and everybody who's been there tonight.
Educated, they weren't smart. They were educated in different ways. And it's very clear, these letters, the spelling may be irregular. Spelling was irregular in a lot of places. But you could see people putting their thoughts together, thinking about the issues, thinking about what they had heard during the National Convention on the radio. And I think that it's really easy to kind of dismiss because the spelling is off or the punctuation is off. These are really great letters in many cases. And I think that in many cases were every bit as well written by people who had no formal education as some of the first year papers. So and I think that you have to be careful about equating a lack of formal education with people being stupid or gullible or easy to manipulate. People that were quoting the National Convention, they were passing newspapers around, and if they get past the spelling, punctuation like that, and you can just be very proud of our ancestors and how they express their feelings.
All right, and just one last call there. I think we have one person there in the audience. Do you like to just go for it and be our last question of the evening? Great. So our last question is how many letters? And I'm going to give it to Vicki for our final. I know this mic back and forth. So how many letters are in the collection?
Yeah. So how do we all the letters right until these last day in office? So there are yeah, go in there and like, it's like, boom! Comes out with this giant boxes and boxes and boxes. And that's just the brief period that we investigated. So we go right out to the 70s. This is a treasure trove and you much better. Oh. So, right? Yeah. But that's beautiful. Yeah. Everybody knows the direct concert and her. Here's my book. She's doing this. And she wrote it with this bus. Who is approximately in the photo?
So thank you so much for that last question there, and Vicki for that really great and enthusiastic response. I think that question actually speaks to one of the core themes of tonight, which is the history of and experience of Confederation is rich, and we have it in living memory still and in archives in this province. And I think as a historian myself, to speak to the work of this panel and this exciting book, I think there's a call to dive into our history, to have those conversations and to just explore that. It's there. Go to the archives, go visit. They're happy to see you. And there are wonderful stories and challenging stories and complicated stories all there. And waiting for someone to read and to write. And you're invited. So on that note, I'm going to bring our evening to a close and just say thank you to all of our participants who joined us online and to all of you who came in person and found our second room. We're so glad to have you. And it's been a wonderful evening. So I'd like to invite you to just a round of applause to say thank you to our panelists. And to wish you a wonderful evening as we look to the end of the 75th anniversary as it is upon us this weekend. It is. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you so much. You did it.